My brother blew out his birthday candles at his party and said, "I wish my sister would die so I can finally be an only child." What did you just wish for? I stood there holding the cake server while my 23-year-old brother Nathan smiled at our parents and the 40 guests at his birthday party like he'd said something clever. My parents had thrown him this huge party at a country club, even though he still lived at home and had never held a job for more than 2 weeks. I said it out loud so it would come true. Nathan laughed and looked right at me. Every birthday for the past 10 years I've wished for the same thing, to be an only child. This year I decided to be specific about how. My mother dropped her champagne glass and it shattered on the marble floor. "Nathan, what are you saying?" He shrugged and started opening presents like he hadn't just wished death on me in front of everyone. "Come on, Mom, you know life would be easier with just me. No competition, no sharing inheritance, no perfect sister making me look bad." Our cousin Lisa gasped from across the room. "You're seriously admitting you want your sister dead?" Nathan looked up from unwrapping an expensive watch our parents got him. "Not want. Wish. There's a difference." He held up the watch. "See this? Cost $3,000. Imagine if they didn't have to buy her gifts too. I could have gotten a Rolex." I'd actually bought my own birthday presents for the past 5 years because our parents forgot my birthday but always remembered his. Nathan, they forgot my birthday completely last year. He smiled. "Yeah, that was great. One step closer to them forgetting you exist entirely." Our Aunt Margaret stood up from her table. "This is disgusting. How can you say this about your sister?" Nathan rolled his eyes. "Because it's true, Aunt Margie. Everyone thinks it, but I'm the only one honest enough to say it." He pointed at me. "She makes everything about her achievements. Her promotion, her engagement, her new house. All things I'd worked for while he played video games in our parents' basement. You live in Mom's basement, Nathan." He stood up angry. "Because she took all the good opportunities. She got the scholarships. She got the internships. She got everything because she was born first." He was actually blaming me for being older. If I'd been born first, I'd be successful too. Our dad finally spoke up. "Nathan, you dropped out of college 3 times. Nathan turned on him. "Because professors compared me to her. Do you know how hard it is being the stupid sibling?" He'd never studied, just expected to pass because our parents donated money. "I'm not stupid. I'm just overshadowed." My fiancé James stood up. "You're not overshadowed. You're lazy and entitled." Nathan laughed bitter. "Of course you defend her. You probably wish I was dead too so you don't have to deal with me at family events." James didn't deny it, which made Nathan angrier. "See? Everyone would be happier if I was an only child." Our grandmother, who'd been quiet until now, slammed her cane on the floor. "Nathan Michael Turner, you're a disgrace." She walked toward him slowly. "Your sister paid for your rehab twice." Everyone went silent. Nathan's gambling addiction wasn't supposed to be public knowledge. "Grandma, that's private." She kept going. "She paid your DUI lawyer. She paid your credit card debt. She's been paying your car insurance." She looked at our parents. "Did you know your precious son owes his sister $50,000? Mom went pale. $50,000? Nathan said he paid for everything himself. Grandma laughed harsh. "Himself? He hasn't worked in 2 years. His sister has been supporting him." She pulled papers from her purse. "I have the receipts because she needed a co-signer for the loans she took out to cover his debts." Nathan tried to grab the papers, but Grandma hit him with her cane. "Don't you dare. These prove what a parasite you are." Our family friend Robert, who was a lawyer, looked at the papers. "These are legitimate loans in your sister's name for Nathan's expenses." He looked at me. "You've been paying for his entire life?" I finally spoke. "He's my brother." I thought I was helping. Nathan laughed. "Helping? You were showing off. Look at perfect sister saving the day again." He kicked a chair. "I never asked for your help." That was a lie. He'd called me crying every time begging for money. "You called me at 3 a.m. threatening to hurt yourself if I didn't pay your dealer." Everyone gasped and Nathan's face went red. "That was private. You had no right to tell anyone." James pulled out his phone. "I have the voicemails, Nathan. 27 voicemails of you threatening suicide if she didn't give you money." He played one, and Nathan's voice filled the room, slurred and desperate, begging for $5,000 or he'd jump off a bridge. The room went dead quiet, and I watched Nathan's face change from smug to shocked to angry in about 3 seconds. Mom started crying these big, ugly sobs while Dad just stared at Nathan like he'd never seen him before. Grandma stood there with her cane raised like she was ready to hit him again if he tried anything stupid. The 40 guests sat frozen in their chairs, and I could hear silverware clinking somewhere in the distance from another event at the club. Nathan's hands were shaking, and his face went from red to almost purple. He looked at James's phone like he wanted to throw it across the room. Nathan jumped up and lunged at James, trying to grab the phone. Robert moved faster than I expected for a guy in his 60s and got between them. He put his hand on Nathan's chest and pushed him back. Nathan stumbled and almost fell into his birthday cake. Robert's voice was calm, but firm when he told Nathan to sit down right now. Nathan looked around the room at all the guests staring at him. Some people had their phones out recording everything. Our cousin Lisa had her hand over her mouth looking horrified. The table next to us had stopped eating their salads to watch. I realized right then that there was no taking this back. Everyone knew everything now. Aunt Margaret stood up and her chair scraped loud against the marble floor. She grabbed her purse and announced she was leaving because she wouldn't stay at a party for someone who wished death on family. She walked toward the exit and didn't look back. Her husband got up and followed her. Then Uncle Tom and his wife stood up. Then more people. Within 5 minutes, half the guests were gone. Mom jumped up and tried to stop people at the door, begging them to stay. She kept saying Nathan didn't mean it and he was just upset and please don't leave. Grandma walked over and grabbed Mom's arm. She told Mom to stop making excuses. She said Nathan meant every single word and everyone knew it. Mom's face crumpled and she started crying harder. Dad finally moved for the first time since the voicemail played. He looked at Nathan and asked if everything Grandma said was true about the $50,000. His voice sounded weird and quiet. Nathan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He just sat there staring at the floor. Dad waited maybe 30 seconds, then turned to look at me. He had tears running down his face, and I'd never seen my dad cry before. He asked why I never told them. I took a deep breath and explained that Nathan threatened to hurt himself every single time I thought about telling anyone. I said he'd call me in the middle of the night saying he'd kill himself if I told Mom and Dad about the money. Dad's face went pale and he sat down hard in his chair. A man in a suit approached our table and I recognized him as the country club manager. He spoke quietly and suggested we move this conversation to a private room since other guests were complaining about the noise. He gestured toward a hallway. Mom nodded and gathered her purse. We all stood up and followed the manager down a long hallway with fancy paintings on the walls. He opened a door to a small conference room with a big table and leather chairs. We filed in and the manager closed the door behind us. Through the window, I could see the remaining guests at the party eating cake and talking in hushed voices. Just immediate family was in the conference room now, plus James and Grandma and Robert. Robert spread Grandma's papers out on the conference table. He put on reading glasses and went through each document carefully. He confirmed that I was legally responsible for loans totaling $47,000. He pointed at different lines on the papers showing Nathan's name as the reason for each loan. He explained that Nathan had no legal obligation to pay me back unless we created a formal repayment agreement with signatures and witnesses. Mom gasped and put her hand over her mouth. She looked at Nathan and asked if he really expected me to just lose all that money. Nathan didn't answer. Robert kept going through the papers showing rehab bills and lawyer fees and credit card statements all in my name. Nathan suddenly exploded out of his chair. He yelled that we were all ganging up on him on his birthday. He said I was trying to ruin his life by exposing his private struggles in front of everyone. He pointed at me and called me vindictive. James pulled out his phone again and scrolled through something. He played another voicemail and Nathan's voice filled the room calling me a stupid bitch for not sending money fast enough. He was slurring his words and threatening to show up at my work and make a scene. Dad stood up fast and told Nathan to shut his mouth right now. Nathan looked shocked like Dad had never talked to him that way before. I felt something break inside me and suddenly I was talking. I told them about every 3 a.m. phone call, every threat. Every time Nathan said he'd kill himself if I didn't pay his dealer or cover his bar tab or bail him out of whatever mess he'd made. I told them about the time he called me from a casino parking lot saying he'd drive his car into a wall if I didn't wire him $2,000 in the next hour. I told them about finding him passed out on my doorstep at 4 a.m. covered in his own vomit. Mom kept saying she had no idea over and over. Grandma cut her off and said willful ignorance was still a choice. She said Mom and Dad chose not to see what was happening because it was easier than dealing with it. Dad turned to Nathan and asked him directly how he planned to pay for his lifestyle with no job and no income. Nathan mumbled something I couldn't quite hear. Dad asked him to repeat it louder. Nathan said he figured he'd get his inheritance someday. The entitlement in that statement hung in the air like smoke. Dad stared at Nathan for a long moment, then stood up and walked toward the door. He yanked it open and walked out into the hallway. We heard a loud bang and then another. Dad was punching the wall. Mom started to get up, but Grandma told her to sit down and let him process this. James suggested we all take a break and meet again tomorrow when emotions weren't running so high. He said we needed time to cool off and think clearly. Nathan shook his head and said he refused to meet again. He said this was all my fault, and he was done with his family. He stood up and headed for the exit. Grandma moved faster than I'd seen her move in years. She got to the door before Nathan and blocked it with her cane held horizontal. She looked up at him and told him if he walked out that door right now, he was choosing to lose his entire family. She said this was his one chance to face what he'd done and try to fix it. Nathan stood there with his hand on the doorknob, looking between Grandma and the rest of us. Nathan's hand stayed frozen on the doorknob for what felt like forever. His shoulders started shaking, and then tears ran down his face, and for the first time in my entire life, he looked actually broken, instead of just trying to get sympathy. He turned around and walked back to the table with his head down. He dropped into the chair hard and put his face in his hands. His voice came out so quiet I almost couldn't hear it when he said he didn't know how to fix this. Mom jumped up from her seat and rushed toward him with her arms out. Grandma's cane came down on the table with a bang that made everyone jump. She pointed at Mom and told her to sit down right now. Mom froze halfway to Nathan and her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but something in Grandma's face made her back up and sink into her chair. Nathan kept his face in his hands and his whole body shook with crying that sounded real for once. Robert cleared his throat and spread Grandma's papers across the table. He said we needed to talk about two separate issues that were connected, but had to be handled differently. The financial situation was one thing, and Nathan's gambling addiction was another. Robert looked around at all of us and said, if there was any hope of this family working things out, both problems had to be addressed seriously. He said Nathan needed real treatment this time, not the outpatient programs I'd paid for before where he could just skip sessions. Robert pulled out his phone and scrolled through something, then said he knew an inpatient facility that specialized in gambling addiction, and they had a 60-day program. Nathan's head came up and he wiped his face with his sleeve. He said he couldn't do 60 days away from home. Grandma laughed and asked what home since he was about to be kicked out anyway. Dad came back into the room right then, and everyone turned to look at him. His knuckles were scraped and bleeding, and there were dents in the hallway wall visible through the open door. He walked straight to Nathan and stood over him. Dad's voice came out flat and cold when he said Nathan had 1 week to find a job, or he was out of the house for good. Nathan actually laughed, but it sounded bitter and mean. He said no one would hire him with his record and his DUI and the fact that he'd been fired from every job he'd ever had. Dad leaned down close to Nathan's face and said, maybe he should have thought about that before getting the DUI that I paid to make disappear. Nathan's laugh died and he looked down at the table. I felt something inside me finally break loose and I stood up. My voice shook when I said I was done paying for anything else. I said Nathan needed to face real consequences for once in his life, instead of having me bail him out every time. Mom turned to me with tears on her face and said I was his sister, and family helps family. James stood up next to me and his hand found mine under the table. He said I'd been helping for 2 years while they forgot I existed. He said I'd taken out loans that would take me a decade to pay off while Nathan played video games and gambled away money he didn't have. Mom started to say something, but James kept going. He said they threw Nathan a $3,000 party at a country club while they forgot my birthday completely last year. Mom's face crumpled and she put her hand over her mouth. Grandma stood up and everyone went quiet. She planted her cane on the floor and looked at Nathan. She said she was cutting him out of her will until he completed treatment and paid back at least half of what he owed me. Nathan's head snapped up and the look on his face told me everything. He'd been counting on that inheritance. He'd been planning his whole future around money he hadn't earned. Mom gasped and grabbed Grandma's arm. She begged Grandma to reconsider and said Nathan needed that security. Grandma pulled her arm away and said Nathan needed to learn that actions have consequences. She said she'd watched him manipulate this family for years, and she was done enabling it. Robert suggested we all take some time to calm down and meet again in a few days. He said we should do it at Grandma's house with a family therapist present so we could work through this properly. He said he'd draft a formal repayment agreement for Nathan to sign that would make the debt legally binding. Nathan looked up and asked what would happen if he didn't sign it. Robert met his eyes and said I could sue him for the money. He said it would probably bankrupt Nathan, but the debt was real and documented. Nathan slumped back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. We agreed to meet at Grandma's house in 3 days at 2 in the afternoon. Robert said he'd find a therapist who could come on short notice. Everyone started gathering their things, and the remaining party guests outside had gone quiet. I could see them through the conference room window, pretending not to watch us. James took my hand and led me toward the door. My legs felt shaky, and my whole body trembled like I'd been running. We walked through the country club past all the people who'd heard Nathan wish me dead. Some of them looked away, and some of them stared. James kept his arm around me the whole way to the parking lot. He drove us home, and I shook so hard in the passenger seat that my teeth chattered. He reached over and held my hand on the center console. He said he was so proud of me for finally standing up to them. I felt guilty and relieved and angry all mixed together in my chest. I couldn't stop seeing Nathan's face when everyone turned against him. Part of me felt bad for him, and part of me felt like he deserved it, and I didn't know which feeling was right. We got home, and I fell asleep still wearing my dress from the party. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. I picked it up and saw 63 text messages from different family members. Some of them said I did the right thing, and some of them said I was cruel. I scrolled through them with my stomach turning. Mom's message was near the bottom, and it said I humiliated Nathan publicly and destroyed his birthday. She said I was vindictive and selfish, and I should be ashamed. I turned my phone off and dropped it on the bed. James came in with a plate of eggs and toast. He set it on my lap and sat next to me. He said Nathan humiliated himself by wishing me dead in front of 40 people. He said I just finally told the truth about what he'd been doing to me. I picked at the eggs but couldn't really eat. The house phone rang around 10 and I almost didn't answer it. James picked it up and said it was Grandma. I took the phone and she told me Nathan showed up at her door at 2 in the morning. He was drunk and begging for money. She said he pounded on her door and yelled until the neighbors' lights came on. She called the police and they removed him from her property. Her voice was steady when she said Nathan needed to hit rock bottom before he'd accept real help. She said she went through the same thing with my grandfather's alcoholism decades ago. She said sometimes loving someone meant letting them fall. I thanked her and hung up. My phone buzzed again even though I'd turned it off and I saw James had turned it back on. There was a new message from Aunt Margaret. She said she wanted to apologize for not seeing what was happening sooner. She said she always thought Nathan was just immature, but now she realized he'd been actively manipulative. She offered to help pay for the family therapy sessions. She said she felt guilty for enabling him at family gatherings by laughing at his jokes about me. I read her message 3 times and something in my chest loosened just a little. I spent the next 2 days trying to focus on work, but kept checking my email every few minutes. Robert sent the draft agreement on Thursday morning, and I opened the attachment with my hands shaking. The document was 12 pages long with official legal language that made everything feel suddenly real. Nathan Turner would pay $500 per month for 96 months with 4% annual interest, bringing the total to $57,000. I stared at the numbers until they blurred together on my screen. James came up behind my desk chair and read over my shoulder. He put his hands on my shoulders and squeezed gently. He said I probably wouldn't see most of that money, but having it in writing meant Nathan couldn't pretend the debt didn't exist anymore. I printed the agreement and put it in a folder, even though I knew I'd never stop thinking about how much I'd lost trying to save someone who resented me for it. The house felt too quiet that afternoon, so I went for a walk around the neighborhood and tried not to calculate how many years of savings I'd given away. My phone rang while I was 3 blocks from home and Dad's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer because I couldn't remember the last time he'd called me directly instead of having Mom do it. His voice sounded rough when he asked if I could meet him for coffee tomorrow morning before the family meeting. I said yes before I could think of a reason to say no. He suggested a place near my office and said he'd be there at 8. I walked home slowly, wondering what he wanted to say that required meeting alone. Dad was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived at the coffee shop. He looked terrible with dark circles under his eyes and his shirt wrinkled like he'd slept in it. He stood up when he saw me and pulled out my chair, which he'd never done before in my entire life. I sat down and ordered black coffee from the server who came over. Dad ordered the same and we sat in silence until she walked away. He folded his hands on the table and stared at them for a long time. He said he'd been a terrible father to me while spoiling Nathan into someone useless and entitled. His voice cracked on the word terrible, and I realized he was crying. I didn't know what to say, so I just waited. He wiped his eyes with a napkin and told me about the miscarriage Mom had between Nathan and me. They'd gotten pregnant when I was 2 and lost the baby at 5 months, and Mom fell apart for almost a year. He said when Nathan was born 3 years later, they were so terrified of losing another child that they became overprotective and indulgent. He knew it wasn't an excuse, but wanted me to understand why they'd become so unbalanced as parents. The server brought our coffee, and we both pretended we weren't crying in public. Dad said they'd started treating Nathan like he was fragile, and me like I was strong enough to handle anything, including being ignored. He apologized for forgetting my birthdays and missing my college graduation, and not coming to see my new house. He broke down completely, and put his face in his hands while his shoulders shook. I reached across the table and touched his arm because I didn't know what else to do. He looked up at me with red eyes and said he was so sorry for making me invisible in my own family for 26 years. I pulled my hand back and wrapped it around my coffee cup. I told him the explanation helped me understand their behavior, but didn't erase the hurt of growing up feeling like I didn't matter. He nodded and said he knew that and wasn't asking for immediate forgiveness. He said he wanted to rebuild our relationship if I was willing to try to. He'd already started seeing someone to work on his enabling patterns. He'd had 3 sessions so far and was learning how much damage he'd done by always choosing Nathan's comfort over everyone else's well-being. I asked him what made him finally decide to change after 23 years. He said hearing those voicemails of Nathan threatening suicide to manipulate money from me made him realize his son had become a monster, and it was his fault for never saying no. He said watching me pay for everything while they threw Nathan an expensive party made him sick with shame. We sat there for another hour while he asked questions about my life that he should have asked years ago. He wanted to know about my job and my engagement and what I like to do on weekends. It felt strange having his full attention for the first time, but also nice in a sad way. When we left, he hugged me tight and said he'd do better starting now. The family meeting at Grandma's house was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon on Saturday. I arrived with James at exactly 2 and found Mom, Dad, and Grandma already sitting in the living room. A woman in her 40s with short gray hair and kind eyes stood up and introduced herself as Siobhan Buchanan. She shook my hand and James's hand and asked us to sit anywhere we felt comfortable. The living room had 2 couches and 3 chairs arranged in a circle, and I chose a chair near the window. James sat in the chair next to mine and took my hand. Siobhan explained the ground rules for our session, including no interrupting, no name-calling, and no walking out without permission. She said everyone would get a chance to speak, and she'd moderate to keep things productive. We all nodded and then sat in awkward silence waiting for Nathan. 2:15 came and went with no sign of him. Mom kept checking her phone and texting him. At 2:30, the doorbell finally rang and Grandma went to answer it. Nathan walked in looking like he hadn't showered in days. His hair stuck up in different directions and his clothes were wrinkled. He sat in the chair farthest from me without making eye contact with anyone. Mom immediately got up and tried to sit on the arm of his chair, but Siobhan gently told her to return to her seat. Mom looked hurt but sat back down on the couch next to Dad. Siobhan started by thanking everyone for coming and acknowledging how difficult this situation was for the whole family. She said the goal today was to understand what happened and start building a path forward. She looked at Nathan and asked him to explain in his own words why he'd wished for my death at his birthday party. Nathan stared at the floor and didn't say anything. Siobhan waited patiently while the silence stretched out. Mom started to speak, but Siobhan held up her hand. After what felt like 10 minutes, Nathan finally spoke, so quietly we could barely hear him. He said he resented me for being successful when he felt like a complete failure. He said watching me accomplish things made him feel worthless and small. He said he wanted me gone, so he could stop being compared to me every single day. His voice got louder as he talked, and he looked up at me with tears running down his face. He said every time someone mentioned my promotion, or my engagement, or my house, it felt like they were pointing out how much he'd screwed up his own life. He said he knew it was wrong to wish me dead, but in that moment he just wanted the comparison to stop. I waited until Siobhan nodded at me before I spoke. I pointed out that nobody in our family compared us except him. I said I never bragged about my achievements around family because I knew it made him uncomfortable, so I barely mentioned anything good that happened to me. Nathan stared at me and then admitted that was true. He said it didn't matter if I talked about my life or not, because my mere existence felt like a judgment of his failures. Siobhan wrote something in her notebook and said that was called projection. She explained that Nathan was comparing himself to me internally and then blaming me for the comparison. Nathan nodded slowly and said he'd never thought about it that way. Siobhan asked him what he thought would actually happen if I wasn't in his life anymore. Nathan was quiet for a minute and then said he'd probably just find someone else to resent for being better than him. The honesty in that answer surprised everyone, including him. Mom had been silent the whole time, but now she started crying. She said she enabled Nathan by making excuses for his behavior and treating him like a child instead of an adult. She looked at me and apologized for neglecting my accomplishments and forgetting my birthdays. She said she didn't know how to be a good mother to me because she'd never tried, and that was unforgivable. She cried harder and Dad put his arm around her. She said she was so focused on protecting Nathan that she forgot I needed parents too. Siobhan handed her a tissue box and asked her what she thought she could do differently going forward. Mom wiped her eyes and said she needed to stop making Nathan's problems the center of everything and start treating both her children equally. She said she knew that sounded simple, but it would be hard to change patterns that had lasted over 20 years. Siobhan turned to address the whole room. She said our family had been running a broken system where Nathan's needs always came first, and everyone else adjusted around him. She said breaking that pattern would require everyone to change their roles, not just Nathan. She recommended weekly family sessions for 3 months and individual therapy for both Nathan and Mom to work on their specific issues. Dad said he was already in individual therapy and would keep going. Grandma said she didn't need therapy because she was the only one who'd been seeing clearly this whole time. Siobhan smiled and said sometimes the people who think they don't need help are the ones who need it most, but she wouldn't force anyone. I said I'd do whatever it took to fix this family, or at least figure out if it could be fixed. Nathan asked what would happen if he didn't want to participate in therapy. The room went completely silent. Dad's voice came out hard and firm when he said Nathan would be evicted from their house and cut off financially if he refused treatment. Mom started to protest, but Dad talked over her. He said he was done enabling Nathan's refusal to take responsibility for his own life. He said Nathan had 1 week to decide between getting help or getting out. Mom looked at Dad with her mouth open like she'd never heard him speak that way before. I stared at my father enforcing a real boundary for the first time in my memory and felt something shift in my chest. Nathan signed the repayment agreement at Grandma's dining room table with Robert standing over him like a court official. His hand shook so badly the pen kept slipping and he had to restart his signature twice. Mom watched from the doorway crying while Dad stood next to Robert making sure Nathan completed every line. The document laid out $500 monthly for 8 years with interest calculated at 4%. Nathan stared at the total amount of $53,000 after interest, and his face went pale. Robert collected the signed papers and made copies for everyone while Siobhan flipped through her notes about treatment programs. She pulled out a brochure for an inpatient facility that specialized in gambling addiction and placed it in front of Nathan. The program ran for 60 days with no phone access for the first 2 weeks and mandatory group therapy twice daily. Nathan pushed the brochure away and said he didn't need to go away for 2 months. Grandma tapped her cane on the floor 3 times and reminded him about the revised will sitting in her lawyer's office. She said the will currently left him nothing and would stay that way unless he completed a real treatment program. Nathan picked up the brochure again and read through the rules about no electronics, no visitors for 3 weeks, and mandatory participation in all activities. Dad said he would personally drive Nathan to the facility next Monday and stay for the family orientation session. Siobhan explained that Marco ran one of the best programs in the state and had a 70% success rate for patients who completed the full 60 days. Nathan asked what happened to the other 30%, and Siobhan admitted some people relapsed, but that didn't mean the program failed them. She said recovery was a choice Nathan would have to make every single day for the rest of his life. Mom asked if she could visit during the program, and Siobhan said family sessions started after week 3. The cost was covered by Dad's insurance, but Nathan would need to contribute his earnings once he found employment. I listened to them plan Nathan's treatment and felt nothing except tired. James squeezed my hand under the table and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Siobhan turned to me and asked what I needed from Nathan before he left for the program. I looked at my brother slumped in his chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The words came out before I could stop them. I told Nathan I needed space from him after the program ended, and that rebuilding trust would take years if it even happened at all. He nodded slowly without arguing or making excuses. Then he apologized for the death wish at his party, and for using me as his personal bank account for 2 years. His voice cracked when he said he understood if I never forgave him. The apology sounded different from all the other times he'd said sorry while asking for money. This one had weight to it, like he actually understood what he'd done. Mom stood up and walked over to where I sat. She asked if I could forgive her for being a bad mother who forgot my birthdays and ignored my accomplishments. I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, but I was willing to try therapy together. She started crying harder and said she didn't deserve another chance, but she'd take whatever I was willing to give. Dad cleared his throat and said we should end the session before everyone fell apart completely. Siobhan scheduled our next family meeting for 2 weeks out and reminded Nathan to stay clean until the program started. We all left Grandma's house in silence, and I sat in James's car watching my parents drive away with Nathan in their backseat. The week before Nathan entered the program felt strange because suddenly my parents acted like actual parents instead of Nathan's personal assistants. Dad took Nathan to the library and helped him fill out job applications online. They printed 15 applications for warehouses, retail stores, and restaurants that didn't require college degrees. Nathan came home with 3 interview appointments scheduled, and Dad bought him khaki pants and button-down shirts from a discount store. Mom ironed the shirts and helped Nathan practice answering common interview questions at the kitchen table. I stopped by their house to drop off some documents Robert needed and found Dad coaching Nathan on proper handshake technique. Nathan saw me watching from the doorway and gave me this half smile that looked embarrassed but also kind of proud. Mom asked if I wanted to stay for dinner, but I said James was waiting at home. The truth was I couldn't handle watching my parents finally parent Nathan the way they should have been doing for 23 years. It felt too late and too little, but also like maybe something was shifting. Dad walked me to my car and apologized again for all the missed birthdays and forgotten achievements. He said seeing the loan documents with my signature on them made him realize how badly they'd failed me. I told him I appreciated the apology, but actions mattered more than words. He nodded and promised he was working on changing his patterns in individual therapy. I drove home and told James about the job applications and the interview clothes. He said it was good my parents were stepping up even if it felt weird after so many years. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about Nathan going to interviews and maybe actually getting hired somewhere. Nathan got called back for a second interview at a warehouse that paid $15 an hour for forklift operators. Dad drove him there and waited in the parking lot for an hour while Nathan met with the hiring manager. They offered him the job on the spot with training starting in 2 weeks. Nathan called me from Dad's car to tell me the news, and his voice sounded different. He said he'd never gotten a job on his own before without Mom calling in favors or Dad making donations. I congratulated him and meant it, even though part of me was still angry about everything. At our next family session with Siobhan, Nathan told everyone about the warehouse job. Siobhan pointed out this was the first thing he'd accomplished independently in years without family money or connections. Nathan admitted it felt different from when things got handed to him. He said filling out the application himself and going through the interview process made the job feel like his, instead of something he didn't earn. Mom cried happy tears and hugged him, which made me uncomfortable because she'd never cried happy tears about my promotions. Siobhan noticed my reaction and asked what I was feeling. I said it was hard watching my parents celebrate Nathan's minimum wage job more than they'd ever celebrated my career achievements. Mom looked crushed and started apologizing, but Siobhan stopped her. She explained that I was allowed to feel hurt about the past, even while supporting Nathan's progress. The session got heavy after that, with everyone acknowledging how unbalanced the family dynamics had been. Dad said he was proud of both his children, and he was sorry it took a crisis for him to show it properly. Nathan's warehouse job started 2 days before he entered the treatment program, so he worked 3 shifts and earned $200. He gave me $50 of it toward his debt without me asking. The gesture surprised me more than the money itself. James and I started planning our wedding during all the family chaos. We'd already booked a venue for 6 months out, but hadn't sent invitations or finalized the guest list. I sat at our kitchen table with the list in front of me and stared at Nathan's name. James asked what I was thinking, and I told him I didn't want Nathan at our wedding even after he completed the program. He said that was completely fair given everything Nathan had put me through. Mom called later that week asking about wedding plans, and I told her Nathan wouldn't be invited. She got quiet on the phone and then asked if I was sure about that decision. I said I was protecting my boundaries and my wedding day needed to be about James and me without worrying about Nathan. Mom sounded hurt, but she said she understood. At our next therapy session, Mom brought up the wedding and said she was struggling with Nathan being excluded. Siobhan asked why it was hard for her, and Mom admitted she wanted the family to look normal and united. Siobhan pointed out that looking normal wasn't the same as being healthy. She asked Mom whose comfort was more important on my wedding day. Mom went quiet, and then said mine was. Siobhan helped her understand that me setting boundaries wasn't about punishing Nathan, but about protecting myself. Mom nodded slowly and said she would support my decision even though it hurt. I felt relief that she wasn't going to fight me on it. After the session, Mom hugged me and whispered that she was proud of me for knowing what I needed. That small moment felt bigger than all her previous apologies combined. Nathan entered Marco's inpatient program on a Monday morning, and Dad drove him there with Mom in the passenger seat. I didn't go with them because I needed distance from the whole situation. James and I stayed home, and I felt this wave of relief knowing Nathan couldn't call me for money or create new emergencies for 2 whole months. We decided to take a weekend trip to the coast to celebrate having space from my family drama. James booked a small bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean, and we left Friday after work. Driving away from the city felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd been wearing for years. We walked on the beach and ate at little restaurants and didn't talk about Nathan or my parents or family therapy. On Saturday night, we sat on the balcony watching the sunset, and James asked how I was really doing. I told him I'd been spending so much mental energy on Nathan's problems that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just live my own life. He said he'd noticed I was always tense waiting for the next crisis call. I realized he was right. For 2 years, I'd been in constant emergency mode, ready to drop everything when Nathan needed saving. The weekend away made me see how exhausting that had been. We stayed an extra night and drove home Monday feeling more relaxed than we'd been in months. I started thinking about what I wanted for my future instead of just reacting to Nathan's disasters. 3 weeks into Nathan's program, my phone rang with an unknown number and I almost didn't answer. It was Marco calling to give us an update on Nathan's progress. He said Nathan had been resistant the first week, but something shifted during a group therapy session. Nathan finally started engaging honestly with the treatment instead of just going through the motions. Marco explained that Nathan admitted to manipulating family members and was working on understanding why he developed those patterns. He said Nathan showed genuine remorse during family processing exercises and seemed committed to changing. Marco thought Nathan had real potential for recovery if he stayed dedicated after leaving the program. I asked if Nathan was just performing for the counselors like he'd performed for everyone else. Marco said that was always a risk with addiction treatment, but Nathan's breakthrough seemed authentic based on his participation level. He'd started helping other patients in group sessions and taking responsibility for his actions without deflecting blame. I thanked Marco for the update and felt cautiously hopeful for the first time. James asked what Marco said, and I told him Nathan might actually be trying this time. We agreed to stay cautiously optimistic but keep our boundaries firm regardless. Mom called a few days later asking if I wanted to start individual mother-daughter therapy sessions, separate from the family meetings. I was surprised she wanted to do extra therapy, but I agreed to try it. Our first session was awkward, with both of us sitting on Siobhan's couch not knowing where to start. Siobhan asked Mom to share some positive memories of my childhood. Mom started talking about teaching me to read when I was 4, and how excited I'd get about new books. She remembered my elementary school science fair projects and how seriously I took my research. She told me about a dance recital where I forgot my routine halfway through but kept dancing anyway, making up moves until the song ended. I'd completely forgotten that recital, but hearing her describe it made the memory come back. She talked about my high school graduation and how proud she felt watching me give the valedictorian speech. I asked why she stopped being present like that, and Mom's face crumpled. She said the neglect got worse as Nathan's problems got bigger. Every time Nathan had a crisis, she dropped everything to fix it, and eventually that became her whole life. She lost herself in trying to save him, and forgot she had another child who needed her too. She cried and said she didn't know how to be both Nathan's crisis manager and my mother at the same time, so she just stopped being my mother. The honesty hurt, but also helped me understand. I told her I needed her to be my mother now, even though I was 26 and didn't need parenting the same way. She said she wanted that too, and she was learning who I was as an adult. Siobhan gave us homework to spend time together without talking about Nathan. Mom and I planned to go shopping the following weekend, just the two of us. Leaving that session, I felt something shift between us, like maybe we could build a real relationship if we both kept trying. Mom and I went shopping the following weekend like we'd planned and actually had a good time together. She asked me about work and listened when I told her about a difficult client I was dealing with, and she didn't bring up Nathan once during the entire lunch. When we got back to my car, she hugged me and thanked me for giving her another chance, and I realized this was the first time in years she'd hugged me without it feeling forced or obligated. James noticed the difference in me when I got home and said I seemed lighter, and I told him I was starting to believe my parents might actually change. The next week, Dad called and asked if he could come by the house, and when he arrived, he was carrying Nathan's gaming computer and all his equipment. He explained that he'd sold everything online for $3,000 and wanted to give me the money as a start toward paying back what Nathan owed. I tried to refuse at first because it felt weird taking money from my parents, but Dad insisted and said Nathan had agreed to it as part of taking responsibility. The check he handed me was made out for $3,000 exactly, and seeing it made me cry because it was the first time either of my parents had acknowledged the financial burden I'd been carrying. Dad sat with me while I cried and apologized again for not seeing what was happening, and he promised this was just the beginning of making things right. $3,000 was barely 6% of what Nathan owed me, but the gesture meant everything because it showed Dad was serious about change. I deposited the check the next day and felt something shift inside me, like maybe I could start believing in my family again. Marco called a few weeks later to tell us Nathan was eligible for family visits, and he thought it would be good for Nathan's recovery if we came. I didn't want to go at first because I was scared Nathan would just perform for us like he always did, but Grandma convinced me to give him one more chance. We drove to the facility together on Saturday morning with Mom crying in the passenger seat the whole way there. The building looked like a regular office complex from the outside, but inside it had that institutional smell that reminded me of hospitals. Nathan was waiting for us in a small visiting room with Marco, and I almost didn't recognize him because he'd gained some weight, and his face looked clearer than I'd seen it in years. He stood up when we walked in and immediately apologized without any of the defensiveness or excuses he usually hid behind. He looked right at me and said he was sorry for wishing I was dead, for stealing my money, for threatening to hurt himself, for making me responsible for his happiness. Mom started crying harder, but Nathan kept his eyes on me and said he understood if I never forgave him, but he wanted me to know he was trying to become someone worthy of being my brother. The apology felt different this time because he wasn't asking for anything, or trying to manipulate me into feeling sorry for him. We sat down and Nathan started talking about his work with Marco, and he explained how he'd been learning about his resentment and entitlement. He said he'd realized that making me responsible for his happiness was unfair and destructive, and that his gambling wasn't just about chasing money, but about punishing himself for feeling worthless. Marco nodded along while Nathan talked and added details about the progress Nathan had made in group therapy. Nathan pulled out a notebook and said he wanted to show us something, and my hands started shaking because I didn't know what to expect. The notebook was his recovery workbook where he'd documented every time he'd manipulated someone and the impact it had on them. He opened it to show us page after page of entries, and my name was on almost every single one. I saw detailed accounts of the 3 a.m. calls, the suicide threats, the lies he'd told to get money, the guilt trips he'd used to make me feel responsible for him. Reading his own words describing what he'd done to me made me start crying, and Nathan cried too while apologizing over and over. He'd written down specific dates and amounts, and exactly what he'd said to manipulate me each time, and seeing it all laid out like that made me realize just how calculated his behavior had been. There were entries about lying to Mom and Dad, about stealing from Grandma's purse, about manipulating friends into lending him money he never paid back. Each entry included a section where he analyzed why he'd done it and who he'd hurt, and the honesty in those reflections felt real in a way Nathan's words never had before. Mom read some of the entries and kept saying she had no idea, and Grandma just sat there with tears running down her face. Nathan explained that writing everything down had been the hardest part of his recovery, because it forced him to face what he'd become, and he couldn't hide behind excuses anymore when he saw his actions written in black and white. Marco joined our session after we'd looked through the workbook, and he explained more about Nathan's addiction and recovery. He said Nathan's gambling had been partly about chasing the high of risk, but also about punishing himself for feeling like he didn't measure up. The self-destruction was Nathan's way of proving to himself that he was as worthless as he believed he was, and every loss reinforced that belief. Marco explained that Nathan was learning healthier ways to cope with feelings of inadequacy, and he was developing tools to handle stress without turning to gambling or manipulation. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic if Nathan stayed committed to his recovery after leaving the program, but Marco emphasized that addiction was a lifelong struggle, and relapse was always possible. I asked Marco directly if he thought Nathan was just performing for us like he'd performed his whole life, and Marco said that was always a risk, but Nathan's breakthrough seemed genuine based on his participation level. He said Nathan had started helping other patients in group sessions, and taking responsibility for his actions without deflecting blame, which were good signs of real change. After the visit, Mom admitted she was terrified Nathan would relapse and we'd end up right back where we started. I told her that was always a possibility with addiction, and we couldn't control Nathan's choices. only our own responses to them. We had another session with Siobhan the following week, where we discussed how to support Nathan's recovery without enabling his dysfunction, and Mom practiced saying no to hypothetical requests. Siobhan had Mom role-play different scenarios where Nathan asked for money or made excuses, and it was hard for Mom at first, but she got better at holding boundaries. Dad attended that session too and said he'd already started planning how to help Nathan budget his warehouse paychecks once he was out of the program. Siobhan warned us that the transition from inpatient treatment to regular life would be the most dangerous time for relapse, and we needed to have clear boundaries in place before Nathan completed the program. We agreed that Nathan couldn't move back into the basement and would need to find his own living situation, which made Mom upset, but she didn't argue. 2 months passed and Nathan completed the full 60-day program without any major incidents. Marco called to tell us Nathan had done well and was ready for discharge, and he'd already arranged for Nathan to move into a sober living house instead of coming home. The sober living house had structure and accountability with random drug tests and mandatory recovery meetings, which everyone agreed was healthier than our parents' basement. Nathan kept his warehouse job and started going to daily recovery meetings, and Dad helped him set up a budget for his paychecks. I didn't see Nathan for the first few weeks after he got out because I needed space to process everything, but Dad gave me updates about how he was doing. 2 months after the birthday party, Nathan asked if he could see me at a family dinner Mom was hosting. I agreed because I wanted to see if his changes were lasting now that he was out of the controlled environment. Nathan showed up on time looking exhausted from working 40 hours a week, and he'd lost weight from the physical labor at the warehouse. We sat down for dinner, and halfway through, Nathan pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to me. Inside was a check for $500 with a note saying it was his first payment toward what he owed me. His hands shook when he gave it to me, and he said he knew $500 was barely anything compared to $50,000, but he wanted to start paying me back. I looked at the check and saw it was from Nathan's own account, and the pride in his eyes was something I'd never seen before. He explained that he'd been saving a portion of every paycheck, and this was the first payment of many he planned to make. The check felt heavy in my hands because it represented something more than money. It represented Nathan actually following through on a commitment for the first time in his life. Mom cried and Dad clapped Nathan on the back, and even Grandma looked pleased. I thanked Nathan and told him I appreciated the payment, and he nodded and said he'd keep making them every month. We finished dinner and Nathan left early because he had a morning shift at the warehouse, and after he was gone, James told me he could see real change in Nathan's demeanor. James and I had been planning our wedding during all of this chaos, and we decided on a small ceremony with just 30 guests. I'd made the difficult decision not to invite Nathan even though he'd completed his program and was making payments, because I needed my wedding day to be about me and James without the stress of managing Nathan's presence. Mom struggled with that decision and called me several times asking if I'd reconsider, but she didn't guilt-trip me about it, which showed how much she'd grown in therapy. Siobhan helped Mom understand that my boundary was about protecting myself and had nothing to do with punishing Nathan, and Mom eventually accepted it. Nathan sent me a card 2 weeks before the wedding congratulating James and me, and inside he'd written that he understood why he wasn't invited, and he hoped we had a beautiful day. The card didn't include any guilt trips or manipulation, just a simple congratulations and well wishes. Our wedding day arrived, and it was perfect in its simplicity with just our closest friends and family. Mom helped me get ready and didn't mention Nathan once, and Dad walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes. During the reception, Dad stood up to give a toast, and he started talking about family and second chances. He publicly acknowledged that he'd failed me as a father for most of my life, but said he was grateful I was giving him the opportunity to do better. He talked about how proud he was of the woman I'd become despite his neglect, and he promised to spend the rest of his life being the father I deserved. Several guests came up to me afterward and said how moved they were by his honesty, and I saw some of them crying during his speech. The wedding felt like a new beginning for my whole family, not just for James and me. 3 months after the birthday party, Siobhan had us sitting in her office working on something she called rebuilding positive interaction patterns. She wanted us to practice celebrating my stuff the way we'd always celebrated Nathan's achievements. Mom sat across from me looking uncomfortable when Siobhan asked her to congratulate me on my recent promotion at work. Mom's hands twisted in her lap, and she cleared her throat twice before speaking. She told me she was proud of my promotion to senior manager, and that I'd earned it through hard work. The words came out stiff at first, but she didn't mention Nathan once during the whole thing. Dad nodded along and added that he'd been bragging about me to his golf buddies. Siobhan smiled and said this was progress, even though it felt forced and awkward to all of us. We spent the rest of the session practicing more normal family conversations where I wasn't invisible, and Nathan wasn't the center of everything. My phone rang 2 weeks later while I was making dinner, and Nathan's name popped up on the screen. I almost didn't answer because our conversation still made me tense, but I picked up on the 4th ring. He sounded excited when he told me he'd been promoted to shift supervisor at the warehouse. His voice had this energy I hadn't heard in years, and he talked for 20 minutes straight about his new responsibilities and the raise he'd gotten. He explained how he'd been training new employees and organizing the loading schedules. I realized halfway through the call that he hadn't asked me for anything, or made the conversation about himself in a manipulative way. He was just sharing good news like normal siblings do. I felt something shift in my chest that might have been actual happiness for him. We hung up, and I stood there holding my phone thinking that maybe this was what healthy sibling relationships felt like. Grandma called Nathan the following Sunday and invited him to dinner at her house. I heard about it later from Mom, who'd been there when Grandma made her announcement. Grandma told Nathan she was thinking about putting him back in her will if he kept up his progress for 6 more months. Nathan thanked her and said something that surprised everyone in the room. He told Grandma he wasn't doing this recovery work for inheritance money anymore. He said he wanted to become someone his family could actually be proud of. Mom cried when she repeated the story to me over the phone. She said Nathan's face looked different when he said it, like he actually meant the words instead of just saying what people wanted to hear. My birthday arrived in early October, and I woke up expecting the usual nothing from my parents. James kissed me and handed me a card before heading to work. I was drinking coffee when my doorbell rang at 9 in the morning. Mom stood on my porch holding a bakery box and looking nervous. She said she'd organized a small surprise party with just family and asked if I could come to her house at noon. I drove over later feeling weird about the whole thing. When I walked in, Dad and Grandma were there with a cake and decorations. Mom handed me a wrapped package that turned out to be a photo album she'd made herself. Inside were pictures of me as a kid with handwritten notes on every page. She'd written apologies for missing my dance recitals and forgetting my 14th birthday and not being there for my college graduation. We sat on her couch looking through the album together, and both of us ended up crying. She kept saying she was sorry and touching my hand. Dad stood in the doorway watching us with wet eyes. 4 months had passed since Nathan's birthday party disaster when he texted asking if I'd meet him for coffee alone. My stomach dropped when I read the message. James found me staring at my phone and asked what was wrong. I showed him the text, and he squeezed my shoulder and said I should only go if I felt ready. I agreed to meet Nathan at a coffee shop near my office the next Saturday. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of him. He'd ordered my usual drink, which meant he'd actually remembered something about me. Nathan looked thinner and tired, but his eyes were clear. He thanked me for coming and said he'd been working with his counselor on making real amends. He told me he wanted to talk about the harm he'd caused without expecting me to forgive him or make him feel better about it. Nathan pulled papers from his backpack and spread them on the table between us. He'd created a detailed payment plan for the full $50,000 he owed me. The plan stretched over 10 years instead of the original 8 years in Robert's agreement. He'd calculated extra payments he could make when he got bonuses or worked overtime shifts. He showed me a spreadsheet with every payment date and amount listed. He said he knew money couldn't fix the emotional damage he'd caused, but he wanted to take complete financial responsibility. I picked up the papers and read through them twice. The level of detail shocked me. He'd thought about interest rates and budgeting and backup plans if he lost his job. This wasn't the Nathan who'd spent his life expecting other people to solve his problems. I set the papers down and looked at my brother across the sticky coffee shop table. I told him I was still hurt, and that rebuilding trust would take years if it even happened at all. I said I appreciated his efforts and felt proud of the progress he'd made. Nathan nodded and didn't get defensive or make excuses. He said he'd keep working on himself whether I ever fully forgave him or not. That response hit me harder than anything else because it showed he'd actually changed. The old Nathan would have guilt-tripped me or gotten angry. This Nathan accepted responsibility for his actions and their consequences. We finished our coffee and he walked me to my car. He hugged me briefly before leaving, and it didn't feel manipulative or forced. James and I hosted Thanksgiving at our house in late November. I'd invited Nathan for the first time since his birthday party blow-up. He showed up on time carrying a covered dish and wearing clean clothes that actually fit him properly. He handed me the dish and thanked us for including him in the holiday. Inside was a green bean casserole he'd made himself following a recipe he'd found online. The dinner felt slightly awkward with everyone being extra polite and careful, but it was peaceful in a way our family gatherings had never been before. Nathan sat next to Dad and they talked about work for a long time. I caught Nathan smiling while describing a problem he'd solved at the warehouse. Dad listened and asked questions and looked genuinely interested. Mom passed dishes and didn't hover over Nathan or baby him. We ate pie and watched football, and nobody fought or cried. 6 months after Nathan's birthday party, Siobhan scheduled a progress evaluation session with our whole family. We crowded into her office and she reviewed her notes from our first meeting. She said we'd made remarkable changes in a relatively short time. She pointed out specific improvements like Mom setting boundaries with Nathan and Dad spending time with me individually. She explained that the work would be ongoing and we'd probably face setbacks. She recommended continuing monthly maintenance sessions to prevent slipping back into old patterns. Everyone agreed immediately because nobody wanted to go back to how things were before. Nathan said the monthly sessions helped him stay accountable. Mom said she needed the structure to keep learning how to be a better parent. Dad just nodded and said he'd be there. Nathan celebrated 6 months of sobriety and steady employment at his recovery meeting the following week. Our whole family showed up to support him when he received his 6-month chip. The meeting room was full of other people in recovery and their families. Nathan walked to the front when his name was called, and were accepted the chip from his sponsor. He gave a speech about hitting rock bottom at his birthday party, and how that moment saved his life. He talked about learning to take responsibility and building real relationships. He thanked me specifically for finally setting boundaries and forcing him to face consequences. He said my refusal to keep enabling him was the greatest gift anyone had ever given him, even though it hurt at the time. People clapped and Nathan came back to sit with us. Mom grabbed his hand and squeezed it. Dad put his arm around Nathan's shoulders. Grandma wiped her eyes with a tissue. I sat there watching my family support my brother and felt something close to hope. Mom called me the following week and asked if I wanted to go shopping with her. I almost said no out of habit, but something in her voice sounded different, so I agreed to meet her at the mall on Saturday. We walked through the department store and she picked up a sweater and asked if I thought it would look good on her. I gave her my honest opinion and she actually listened instead of buying it anyway. She put the sweater back and moved to another rack. We browsed for 20 minutes before she stopped and turned to me with tears in her eyes. She said she realized she didn't know anything about my taste or my style or what I liked. I told her it was okay, but she shook her head. She asked about my job and what I did all day, and I started explaining my role in marketing. Mom listened to every word and asked follow-up questions about my projects and my coworkers. She didn't mention Nathan once during the entire conversation. We sat down at the food court with coffee, and she told me she was learning who I was as an adult. She said she was amazed by the person I became despite her neglect. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Dad texted me 2 days later asking if I wanted to meet for breakfast on Wednesday morning. I showed up at the diner near my office and found him already sitting in a booth with a notebook in front of him. He stood up when I arrived and hugged me, which felt strange because we'd never been physically affectionate. We ordered food and he opened the notebook. He said he wanted to start a tradition of weekly breakfast with just me. He explained that he'd been writing down questions about my life because he realized he'd missed everything. Dad asked about my career path and how I got into marketing. I told him about my internships in college and the promotions I'd earned. He wrote notes in his notebook so he could remember details. He asked about my marriage and what James and I like to do together. I told him about our weekend hikes and cooking experiments. Dad kept writing everything down like he was studying for a test. He asked about my dreams for the future and whether I wanted kids someday. I admitted I'd been scared to think about kids because I didn't want to repeat the patterns from our family. Dad put down his pen and said he understood that fear. He promised he'd be a better grandfather than he was a father if I ever decided to have children. Nathan called me the next evening sounding excited. He said he had news and asked if I had a minute to talk. I braced myself for bad news out of habit, but his tone was genuinely happy. He told me he got accepted into community college to finish his degree. I asked how he was paying for it, and he explained he'd saved money from his warehouse job and applied for financial aid. He said he was doing things the right way this time without asking anyone for help. I felt something shift in my chest, hearing the pride in his voice. I told him I was genuinely proud of him and I meant it. He thanked me and said he had to go because he needed to register for classes. The call lasted 3 minutes and he didn't ask me for anything. Grandma invited Nathan to lunch the following Saturday, and he arrived nervous about what she wanted to discuss. She sat him down at her kitchen table and pulled out her revised will. She explained she was including him again, but structuring his inheritance as a trust that paid out over 20 years. Nathan looked at the paperwork and nodded slowly. Grandma told him this would protect him from himself and ensure he couldn't blow everything at once. Nathan surprised everyone by thanking her for the structure. He said he knew he couldn't be trusted with a large sum of money and appreciated her protecting him. Grandma patted his hand and said she was proud of his self-awareness. She poured them both tea and they spent the afternoon talking about his recovery and his plans for school. 8 months had passed since Nathan's birthday party when I realized something had changed in me. I was sitting at my desk at work when I noticed my shoulders weren't tense. I checked my phone and saw no missed calls from Nathan. I hadn't had anxiety about him calling with emergencies in weeks. The mental energy I used to spend on his crises had been reclaimed for my own life. James noticed I was happier when I got home that evening. He commented that I seemed more relaxed and present. We made dinner together and talked about our future. James brought up the possibility of having kids, and I didn't immediately panic. We discussed timelines and what we wanted our family to look like. I felt ready to plan for our own future instead of being stuck managing Nathan's disasters. Our family gathered for Christmas at my parents' house in December. I walked in carrying gifts and noticed the tree had presents underneath with my name on them. The gift distribution looked balanced between Nathan and me for the first time in my memory. Mom handed me a carefully wrapped box, and I opened it to find a leather journal she'd picked out specifically for me. She'd remembered I mentioned wanting to start journaling during one of our shopping trips. Dad gave me a framed photo of us from my college graduation that he'd dug out of storage. Nathan approached me last holding a wrapped frame. I opened it and found a photo of us as kids building a sandcastle at the beach. He'd written a note on the back saying he wanted to be worthy of that sibling bond again. I hugged him and felt tears on my face. We ate dinner together and nobody fought or cried. The conversation flowed naturally with everyone participating equally. Mom asked about my upcoming work project and actually remembered the details from our last conversation. Dad told a story about his own childhood and included me in the discussion. Nathan talked about his classes and seemed genuinely engaged with his education. Nathan stopped by my house in early January with an envelope. He handed it to me and I opened it to find his 8th payment toward his debt. The check brought his total repayment to $4,000. He'd never missed or been late with a single payment. Nathan told me he'd opened a savings account for the first time in his life. He showed me the balance on his phone with obvious pride. He said he was learning to find satisfaction in earning things rather than being given them. He talked about how good it felt to pay his own bills and support himself. I offered him coffee and we sat at my kitchen table for an hour talking about his plans. He wanted to finish his degree and maybe get promoted at the warehouse. He talked about goals and timelines like a completely different person. We rang in the new year together as a family at my parents' house on December 31st. I stood in their living room holding a glass of champagne and looked around at everyone. Mom was laughing at something Dad said while refilling snack bowls. Nathan was helping Grandma to her chair and making sure she was comfortable. James stood beside me with his arm around my waist. I watched the clock count down to midnight and realized Nathan's horrible birthday wish became the catalyst for our family finally getting healthy. We weren't perfect and probably never would be. But we were honest now. We acknowledged our problems instead of hiding them. We held each other accountable instead of enabling destruction. We showed up for each other in real ways instead of performing for appearances. The countdown reached 0 and everyone cheered. I kissed James and hugged my family. Nathan caught my eye across the room and mouthed thank you. I nodded back because I understood what he meant. The truth had hurt all of us, but it also freed us. We had a chance now to build something real instead of maintaining a beautiful lie. That made all the difference.